In your book, you mentioned in the obesity code, you go through a thorough treatment of the calories in, calories out. I imagine that's a big part of obviously your protocols. Can you talk everyone through a lot of the myths around the calories model of weight gain?
Yeah, and this is one of their big problems, is that the kind of root core belief that we have that obesity is due to too many calories is completely incorrect. This is the whole issue, is that we all think that it's a calorie imbalance, right? If you eat more calories, then you'll gain weight. If you eat less calories, then you'll lose weight. But it's not actually true. And you can prove it experimentally. It's been done over and over the past 100 years. So if you try to overfeed people, that is, make them eat a lot, they will gain weight temporarily. But then very quickly, their basal metabolism will rise and try and burn it off. If you make people eat less calories than usual, that is, cut their calories, their bodies will slow down and they won't burn as many calories. So therefore, if you look at it that way, you see that you're kind of not going to win. If you raise your calories in, then you raise your calories out. Weight stays relatively stable. If you lower your calories in, your calories out goes down and you also don't win. Your weight stays stable. So in the end, that was a really bad strategy. And when you go back through it, the body doesn't really have any mechanism to kind of count calories or measure calories. So why would we think it's important? I mean, you can take 1,000 calories of cookies and 1,000 calories of salmon and salad, and as soon as you eat them, they're the same number of calories, but the hormonal response to those foods is completely different. One will stimulate insulin, one won't. One will stimulate things such as peptide YY, cholecystokinin, other hormones. The body knows how to respond to these hormones. That's the kind of common currency of the body. That is, the body knows what to do with these sort of hormonal signals. So for instance, if you have a lot of insulin, your body responds in a certain way. That is to lay down new fat. If it has low insulin, then it will tend not to gain fat. So that's what's really important, because to the body, calories are an entirely foreign language. It has no way to understand how many calories are going in because it doesn't measure it. So if your body doesn't care, why would we care? Why do we think it's so important to measure calories? And that's really the core belief that we've kind of drilled into our kids and told everybody. We have calorie labels, we count calories, we see how much exercise you need to burn off a certain number of calories. But the entire underlying premise of calories is completely incorrect. It's completely unphysiologic. So that's where we get into trouble, and that's the root problem, is that we think it's a calorie deficit. Your body doesn't care about calories at all. And so we are not able to kind of make our bodies lose weight because we're trying to, make ourselves eat less calories, and the body still responds to hormones. So if you eat less calories, but your insulin response is the same, that is, you eat, say, a lot of sugar, a lot of carbohydrates, that kind of thing, then you're not going to lose weight. And that's really where you have to understand the science of weight gain. And that's why I really spend a lot of time talking about calories. This whole thing about, there's another thing they talk about, which is the first law of thermodynamics, which is really, really stupid again. And this is the idea that fat loss or gain or change in fat mass equals calories in minus calories out. Okay, so that's actually true. That's always true. But the problem is this: the calories in and the calories out are not independent variables. Okay, so if you increase your calories in and your calories out increases, or the other way around, so you reduce calories in, but calories out reduces, then fat mass is not changed at all. That is, if you eat 500 less calories and your body burns 500 less calories, which is what happens in the long term, not in the short term, then fat mass doesn't change. You've still fulfilled the first law of thermodynamics, but so what? And Gary Taubes goes over it very well, and I don't understand why anybody believes this whole first law of thermodynamics anymore. It's always correct, but completely irrelevant because it only talks to you about the proximal cause. So, for example, say you go to the airport, say you go to, the Toronto Pearson Airport, it's March break, and it's completely packed. And you say to your friend, wow, this is packed. I wonder why it's so busy. And your friend says, wow, you're so stupid. Of course, there's more people coming in than people leaving. And then it's like, yeah, I know that's stupid, right? But why are there more people here? And the answer is it's March break. That's the ultimate cause, right? The people coming in versus people leaving is proximal cause, but it's useless, right? Because if you believe that, and it's kind of like the same thing, it applies to everything, right? Alcoholism is too much alcohol in and too little alcohol out. So therefore, the only thing you need to know is to either reduce your metabolism, reduce your intake of alcohol, or increase your metabolism of alcohol. Of course, it's so obvious. It's the first law of alcoholic thermodynamics. Well, if you try to say that to an alcoholic, oh, you just have to drink less, they'd be like, what are you, stupid? Right?
Yeah, for sure. It's obvious.
It's obviously not the answer. That's the proximal cause. The ultimate cause is that alcohol is addictive. Alcohol has there are social problems. If you're addicted to it, then you address the addiction, right? So you have Alcoholics Anonymous, you have behavior programs. What you don't have is people going around and saying, oh, you're an alcoholic. This is your fault. You just have to drink less, right? It's like so stupid. But at the same time, we have people going around, oh, you're obese. This is your fault. You should eat less. It's like, that doesn't work. Like, are you an idiot? We've done this for so many people.
Absolutely. I mean, you give a thorough treatment of that in your book, which is, and you mentioned it here, kind of insulin being a fuel selector switch in a sense of high levels directing towards burning carbohydrate or fat storage versus low levels being able to liberate fat and use as a fuel source. Can you give the listeners a sort of an insulin 101? You used a great analogy there about the subway cars in one of your recent lectures, but could you get everyone on the same page on that note?
Yeah, so as long as you understand that calories is not the issue, then you can go back and say, well, what is the issue, right? So calories is only the proximal cause, right? It doesn't tell you anything, right? So then you have to say, well, what does cause obesity, right? And when you get down to it, if you think something causes obesity, right, rather than just being linked to obesity, well, it has to pass the causal test. That is, you give something to somebody and they become obese. Well, it turns out I can make anybody obese. I just need to give them enough insulin. Okay, so if I inject insulin into you, you would become obese. It's just a matter of how much insulin and how long. Your body would fight it, right? But eventually I could break it down with high enough doses. And it happens to all our patients. Every single person who takes insulin understands that it makes people gain weight. Not only that, and people say, well, it's unphysiologic and stuff. You can take medications such as sulfonylureas, which increase the secretion of insulin, and you will gain weight. So it's physiologic insulin. And you can make somebody lose insulin. So type 1 diabetes, for example, people have very, very, very low levels of insulin. And guess what? They actually can't store any body fat. They start to go, become very, very thin, and then they die because they don't have enough insulin. So it's too low. And that's the problem. So really, you can see that insulin is very intimately related to body fatness. So that's the whole thing. And this is where it gets a little bit more technical. So if you understand that insulin is the major cause of weight gain and obesity, right? So it tells the body to store fat, and it tells the body to not burn fat as well. Okay, so it's like those, one-way bridges where cars can only go in one direction. If somebody's coming the other way, you actually have to stop and let them through. That's the same as the body, right? You can either burn energy or you can store energy. You can't do both at the same time because it's not smart. And if insulin is high, you store energy. If insulin is low, you burn energy, right? So if you keep insulin levels high all the time, you're simply telling your body to keep storing energy, and you're not going to burn the stored energy, which is glycogen in the liver and body fat. So that's the essential thing. So a lot of people say that carbohydrates, this is the so-called carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. That is, okay, we understand that insulin is the major cause of weight gain. And what's the major cause of high insulin levels? And some people say it's carbohydrates, but that's not entirely true. refined carbohydrates for sure do stimulate insulin a lot, but it's not the only thing that impacts insulin. And this is where you have to understand about insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is the root cause of type 2 diabetes. Too much insulin resistance is the disease called type 2 diabetes. If you have resistance to insulin, that is, insulin doesn't do what it's normally supposed to do, the body responds by increasing the dose, increasing the amount of insulin. This is called compensatory hyperinsulinemia. And again, if you have insulin resistance, then your insulin levels are high. Well, if insulin levels are high, that's going to drive obesity. So here now all of a sudden you have a second factor. So other than the refined carbohydrates, you have insulin resistance, which is a key factor in keeping those insulin levels high and promoting obesity. So even if you didn't eat any carbohydrates or severely reduced it, as long as you had insulin resistance, you could still have too much insulin and therefore stay obese. And that's the and there are other things such as protein has a different effect on insulin, sweeteners has effect on insulin, things such as dietary fat, proteins, vinegar, all these sort of things can impact insulin levels. And one of them can be manipulated in order to lower insulin levels. But the key one is the insulin resistance. So then you have to go back and say, well, what causes insulin resistance? And that's, again, a more technical answer. But what happens is that the key is the liver, actually. So fatty liver is the major cause of insulin resistance. And this is where people have to understand what insulin resistance actually is. So insulin, one of its jobs is to promote glucose entry into cells. So insulin tells the muscle cells, the liver cells. So let's stick with the liver. So it tells the liver cell to get glucose in. When we have insulin resistance, what we see is that you have a normal amount of insulin, but the glucose isn't going in. So we say, well, that's a problem of insulin resistance. But the question is, why isn't that glucose not going in? And what we say is that, well, there must be something that's kind of interfering with the mechanism. So this is the so-called lock and key paradigm. So insulin acts like a key on the liver cell. It opens a gate, opens a door, lets the glucose in. And we say, well, there's something gumming up that lock and key mechanism, because you can determine the molecular structure of insulin and the insulin receptor, and they're both completely normal on that liver cell in insulin resistance. So there's nothing wrong with the key. There's nothing wrong with the lock or door, but it's not working properly, right? The glucose is not going in. So why is that? And we say, well, there's something gumming up, like there's a piece of gum in the door sort of thing, right? So it's not working. So inside the cell, there's not enough glucose, and outside the cell, there's too much. But this is the whole problem. That entire paradigm is incorrect. So if you think about insulin resistance and you say that there's not enough glucose inside cells, there's internal starvation, then these people should look like type 1 diabetics. That is extremely skinny to the point of death, like cachectic sort of thing. But that's not what type 2 diabetics look like. That's not what people with insulin resistance look like. They're obese. They have big fatty livers. They have a big belly. They're not facing internal starvation. So the other possibility, which is, in my opinion, much more correct, a different paradigm of what insulin resistance is that the cell is simply overstuffed with glucose. So even when you open the door, the glucose can't go in. Just like if you have a bar that's kind of packed, you have a band playing and there's so many people, you open the door, nobody can still go in. It doesn't matter if the door is open or closed. There's no room, so you can't go in.
Like my streetcar rides in the morning in Toronto.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So the door is open and you look at it and then you just let it close again. But on the outside, what it looks like is that there's something wrong. You say, well, there's resistance because you have a normal level of insulin. The doors are open and nobody's going in. But it's not that the door didn't open. The door did open. It's that the cell was too full. So you have the liver, which is overstuffed with glucose, which gets turned into fat, which is through the process of de novo lipogenesis. That is, excessive carbohydrates and particularly fructose are going to cause this fatty liver, which causes you to have insulin resistance, which causes the compensatory hyperinsulinemia, right? So insulin, the body responds by producing more insulin with the thought that, hey, we need more insulin. That's the problem. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the kind of overstuffed liver. So it's fatty liver that really causes the insulin resistance, which causes the high insulin levels, which produces obesity. And this is the important thing, because that insulin resistance needs to be kind of taken care of before you can actually treat obesity. Because if it's a major contributor to the high insulin levels, then even if you change your diet, but you don't get rid of that insulin resistance, you're still going to have obesity because your insulin levels are still going to be high. So that's where that insulin resistance piece is really so important, because nobody really thinks about it. And it actually depends on several things. One, of course, is fructose. You got to get rid of the fructose, because fructose, because of its metabolism, goes straight into the liver and causes fatty liver. Right? And all the studies have shown that if you give people fructose versus glucose, for example, the fructose people will get fatty liver and the glucose people don't, because the rest of your body can metabolize that glucose. That is, if you eat a pound of sugar, it's 50% glucose and 50% fructose. The 50%, so a pound of sugar, half a pound of it is glucose. Your entire body metabolizes that glucose, but only your liver metabolizes the fructose. So like 200 pounds of body mass is metabolizing glucose, and like 5 pounds of liver is metabolizing the fructose. And the thing is that the fructose can get turned into glucose, but why would you? You have plenty of glucose. So it gets turned into fat, and it gets all stored in the liver. So you get fatty liver. In other words, the fructose is much, much, much worse than the glucose, which is the starches. So starchy foods is chains of glucose, but no fructose.
I suppose today, with getting up to about 160 pounds of sugar per person per year, 50% of which is the fructose you're mentioning. Obviously, people are now getting stuck in this position, as you mentioned, hyperinsulinemic. They just cannot burn their own body fat stores as a fuel source. They sort of just become sugar burners, in effect.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that if your problem is insulin resistance, and we know that prediabetes and diabetes affects about 50% of the kind of American population, then you say that's a very important thing that you have to treat before you can treat the obesity. So it's important to understand that the insulin resistance, the resistance depends on one, fructose, but also the sort of persistence of this insulin. So if you're eating all the time, for example, and you're keeping your insulin levels all high all the time, because when you eat, insulin goes up, unless you eat pure fat, which is rare. You don't eat sticks of butter for the most part. But if you, anytime you eat, as long as it has something other than pure fat, you're going to raise your insulin, and your body's going to say, okay, I'm taking in energy. I need to store some of it, right? That's normal. If you keep doing that, you're not going to burn it, and that fat is not going to be pulled out. So one of the things that we use quite effectively is intermittent fasting, because one of the things that we know is that very low calorie diets, and fasting obviously is very low, will preferentially pull out that fat from the liver, because it's the most accessible fat. So when you fast, the first thing that goes down is your glucose, because it takes the stored glycogen out. When the glycogen is gone, then you have to burn fat, and it's a lot easier to take the fat from the liver than it is from the rest of your body, because it's kind of sitting right there. So when you look at studies of fatty liver, for example, you can actually reduce the fatty liver far more than with fasting and very low calorie diets. And that's why they do that for people undergoing bariatric surgery, for example. So they'll put them on extremely low diets or fasting for a week prior to surgery, because they want to shrink that liver way down, because surgically, if you've got a big fatty liver in your surgical field, it's just harder to operate. So you want that liver to shrink right down. And interestingly, when they do that to people, often the diabetes gets incredibly a lot better, because you're actually targeting the actual problem, which is that big fatty liver. And then after the surgery, of course, they can't eat, so they're basically, going on these very low calorie diets again and shrinking that liver further. And that's really why the diabetes goes away very quickly, like within weeks, even though the body weight does not drop that quickly, because that's just the rest of the fat. It's the fat in the liver that's the problem. Fat in the pancreas, that's the problem. Fat in the fat cell turns out to be not as big a deal as the fat that's there, the visceral